Hey everyone, welcome back to the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. I'm Bobby Sylvester with Mike Tagliere as always, and today we have two guests. First, Matt Camp of the Bleacher Report and SiriusXM, then former NFL player Ross Tucker of NBCSN and SiriusXM NFL Radio. Tags, this is going to be fun, man.
It is. It's going to be a good day, and it's already started as a good day, man. On yesterday's show, we had Brandon. We talked about John Ross and the fact that Brandon LaFell should be cut. And I wake up this morning, I get down to my computer, and all of a sudden I see a tweet that goes out that says Brandon LaFell's agent has announced that he's been released.
Yeah.
John Ross is released.
Well, John Ross was not released. He is free to be a good fantasy football player.
He's released upon the fantasy world. That's what I meant. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's all good. We will talk about that a little bit here and a couple other news items. And then we're going to talk about positional battles later in the show with Ross Tucker. But first, we wanted to cover common draft mistakes to avoid with Matt Camp. Matt can be found on Twitter at the Matt Camp. I'm at Bobby Fantasy Pro, and Tags is at Mike Tagliere NFL. Matt, thanks for coming to the show. Happy football season.
Good to be back with you guys. And yes, as Mike and I were talking about off the show, you can only talk about last year so much before we need new information and new things to happen. Not injuries. We're good with those. I know we're all going to be biting our nails for the next month, especially if you do any early drafts, but be good to actually sink our teeth into things happening in 2018.
Agree. Yeah. So I want to talk to you about John Ross, but first, I understand, Matt, that you host a podcast about Japanese wrestling, American style. We're going to need to know more about this, man.
I am a big pro wrestling fan. I do work in the pro wrestling industry during the off season and during the regular season as well. I'm the play-by-play guy for House of Hardcore for old ECW fans. It's Tommy Dreamer's promotion. So I'm a play-by-play guy there, but I have followed wrestling my entire life and kind of as a fun thing, I host the Foreign Aces podcast. A couple of friends of mine, wrestling in Japan is on usually like a 14-hour time difference. So for the big shows, I am up at 3, 4, 5 in the morning watching the shows because as I tell my wife, well, it's all wrestling and I do some wrestling radio on Sirius. So it's work. It's okay. It's work. It's okay for me to get up at 4 o'clock in the morning because it's work. So, and I sold a couple t-shirts, so she's okay with it, which is, I just got to keep that straight up, guys.
There is no reason to ever be awake at 4 o'clock in the morning. Do you agree with me, Tags?
No, I don't agree with you, actually. I mean, me personally, I'm typically up by 5:30, and most of the time, like the latest, like even if I tell myself I want to sleep in and I'm going to take like NyQuil or something like that, the latest I think I've slept in the last 5 years is like 7 o'clock.
That sucks.
I can't get up later than that. So I'm with Matt on this one. It's like the whole sleep when you die. I just feel like there's never enough time in a day to get done what I want to get done. So get up, get after it.
I mean, but you also go to sleep at like 6 p.m., so that doesn't count.
Oh, stop it. I do not. I go to bed at 10 p.m. I am not shy about that. I'm not someone who stays up late. I just get crabby and I'm tired. I just want to lay in bed, put on a movie and fall asleep.
I'm the complete opposite. I go to bed at like 2:30, 3 o'clock in the morning every single day. And during the season, it goes even later. I feel like that's when I do like all my work. I don't know why, but that's, it's 5 o'clock. No, I can't do work now. It's too early. Wait till everyone in the world goes to bed and then I'll work.
So, Matt, I wanted to ask you about John Ross. Obviously, with Brandon LaFell being cut, there's a better chance that John Ross is going to start. I expect his ADP, average draft position, to soar through the roof. Right now, he's being drafted at the very end of drafts, undrafted in a lot of leagues. Matt, just how high do you think John Ross is going to start being drafted at this point?
I don't think it'll rise too much just because last year was so disappointing. And this might get into our discussion on draft mistakes, but, those kind of years leave that awful taste in people's mouths, and that's it. They'll put him out of their heads forever. And maybe part of it is also because it's the Cincinnati Bengals, and it's still Andy Dalton. I mean, I even have trepidation about A.J. Green because I don't want to rely on Andy Dalton. So I can imagine what people think of someone like John Ross. And I kind of wish there was a new regime there. It looked like we might get one. And Marvin Lewis is back once again. And unfortunately, I know he's not the offensive guy, but when you're giving ceremonial first touches to Jeremy Hill every game, you're sending that message to the rest of your team. Maybe John Ross has a long way to go. Maybe this is another Laquan Treadwell situation. I don't know. I don't find myself, unless it's best ball, making any concerted effort to go get him. Maybe if it's a better team, a better quarterback, and the door is open for those reasons, I give him a shot. But I'm not running to go get this guy, and it's not all because of him.
Now, Tex, I'm not exactly worried about A.J. Green because he's always been with Andy Dalton. He's been just fine. Are you worried about Andy Dalton being their quarterback, though?
Not necessarily. I think Andy Dalton has been competent in years past, and that he's another player that people are down on after last year because it just was such a bad year, and the offensive line was so bad. The offensive coordinator changed in the middle of the season, somewhat of a bad schedule to start the year. So again, people had a bad taste in their mouth. I've liked John Ross. I think he's a fantastic player. I don't think he's just a speed guy. And by the way, I want to just say something real quick to those people out there who keep telling me that Tyreek Hill is the reason Alex Smith was so good because he's so fast.
Oh, that annoys me so much.
If Tyreek Hill, the reason that he's going to remain so efficient is because he's so fast. Yeah, we had Chris Harris on the podcast the other day talking about, because Tyreek Hill, he has world-class speed. John Ross is faster. John Ross legitimately set the record. So does that mean that John Ross should be a top 10 wide receiver? No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't at all. I like John Ross. I'm going to move him up. I mean, I would put him ahead of Kenny Galladay. I have no idea why people would draft a number 3 wide receiver over a number 2 in an offense. I think he belongs in the conversation with guys like Calvin Ridley, where it's like they have a stud on their team. Julio Jones and AJ Green, those two are studs. These guys are number 2s. The slot option for Atlanta is a little bit better in Mohamed Sanu, whereas Tyler Boyd I don't have much faith in. So I think that John Ross should be in that wide receiver 50 to 60 range. He's not going to be a consistent fantasy option, but he is going to give you weeks where he can produce when AJ Green might be covered by someone like Jalen Ramsey.
Sounds about right. I've got him at wide receiver 51, so I agree with you. Now, Matt, it sounded like you wanted to say something about Tyreek Hill when Tags was talking about that.
Yeah, he's been kind of tough for me because I don't think you necessarily say, well, he doesn't match with Alex Smith or didn't match, and because of the downfield speed, you don't think of Alex Smith as the big arm guy. Tyreek Hill has had his speed used to his advantage and the team's advantage. And I give credit to what the Kansas City Chiefs did with him the last couple of years. So speed is one thing. We've seen fast guys that are number 4 receivers, and that's all they are. That was not what Tyreek Hill was, nor what he will be now with Patrick Mahomes. Now, maybe there's more deep shots you could take with a big arm guy like Patrick Mahomes, but I don't think that's I feel like that's just putting both guys, whether it be Ross or Hill, in a box. What I wonder is, can the Bengals be creative enough to get the most out of John Ross's skill set? And I think that remains to be seen.
Fair. That's fair.
Now, I've got one other guy I want to talk about here, Josh Doxson. We mentioned earlier, and we don't really need to say too much. I was worried that it might be a lingering issue or might last for a while. Josh Doxson just has a shoulder bruise. He's good to go, so draft away.
Yep, he's good.
All right, guys, let's hop into common draft mistakes. And the way we're going to do this, we're going to do the roundtable format. So we've each got, 3 to 5 of them that we're going to talk about. Common draft mistakes we want to avoid. And we're just going to go in a roundabout way. Tags, why don't you go first to show us one common draft mistake to avoid?
Yeah, so basically, we just talked about Tyreek Hill. Do not draft on last year's stats, guys. Don't do that. If we were playing fantasy football in 2017, Tyreek Hill would be a second-round pick, and that's fine. But don't draft. Things change around players. Tyreek Hill is one of the biggest one with Sammy Watkins being added. Yes, Patrick Mahomes has a big arm, but yes, Alex Smith was able to deliver those deep balls to Tyreek Hill last year. Andy Reid has a good grasp on how to use Tyreek Hill. Another player, Evan Engram. Things change, guys. 115 targets last year. That's not happening. Honestly, I went through it, and it's going to be hard for him to see 90 targets this season.
Yep, absolutely.
Agree.
Don't draft Evan Engram as the number 5 tight end just because he finishes the number 5 tight end last year. And on the opposite end of that, DeAndre Hopkins, you remember him in 2016? He was the wide receiver 36 with 151 targets. He was falling to the 3rd round sometimes last year. Don't draft on last year's stats, guys. Things change around these players. You have to adjust for that, and that's one of the biggest mistakes I see people make.
Matt, it sounded like you are also low on Evan Engram. Is that true?
Yeah, it's not that I'm low on the player. He's a good player, but Beckham's here, and they have a running game now and possibly a great running game here. So necessity goes a long way. Evan Engram bucked the trend of rookie tight ends last year. We're not used to getting useful, and he was more than useful rookie tight ends, and he came through. But he did so when Beckham went down. No Brandon Marshall, no real rushing attack, at least a consistent one. And if you want to throw this in here, Sterling Shepard missed time too. He got a ton of opportunities. He did well with those opportunities for the most part. But I'll tell you right now, I have him at 8. People have him at 5, maybe 4, and it's not a knock on him. But when you add back one of the best wide receivers in the game and the best running back prospect, there's only so much to go around. And I think from cutting back on his targets, from Beckham being there, and then maybe just not throwing the ball quite as much because you have Barkley, you don't have to draft him based on last year. So many changes happen, guys. I hate going too far back in history ever. I hate hearing, oh, this team is 36-5 against them, and that's different ages, that's different coaches and players and all that. I try to stay as recent as possible when it comes to these history stats, and for a guy like Ingram, I think it's pretty obvious. And as I said, the flip side, there's going to be guys that bounce back this season. DeAndre Hopkins was that last year. There's going to be guys who now are in better situations or are healthier, and they're going to bounce back as well. So, there's some of the things you can go off of. Hey, this guy's in the same spot, same coach, same quarterback, same situation. There's things to base this off, and you could stick with it. But other guys are in much different situations, and you have to act accordingly.
Tags and I are with you on Evan Ingram. In fact, everyone we've had on our show seems to be with us on Evan Ingram. Tags, do you remember anyone who's drafting Evan Ingram as the 4th or 5th tight end? I don't know who's making these rankings because he's still the tight end number 4 or number 5 in terms of ADP and ECR, which is expert consensus rankings, yet everyone we talk to has him 8 or 9.
Yeah, he finally dipped in ADP where he went down to number 6 behind Jimmy Graham and Greg Olsen, which, by the way, I would actually draft Evan Ingram over Jimmy Graham. And that's just me. So that's not the order that I would have them. When, we're talking about the tight end position, if you're investing a pick in the top 8 rounds in one, you should probably have one that gives you some safety. So, Kyle Rudolph, Delaney Walker, these are guys that I would take over someone like Evan Ingram. Obviously, the big 3 names. But when you get down to that territory, why not go with someone like a Trey Burton? And again, I'm coming out with a player profile maybe next week on Evan Ingram. I've done the research on that. So I think that's I think we all agree on this one though. Don't draft on last year's stats. Understand that things change around these players. Matt, what's your biggest mistake that you see drafters make?
Don't stick to a rigid draft philosophy, especially early on in the year. And this is also kind of based off the idea of what happened last year. So last year, as we know, guys, one of the worst years, at least in recent memory, probably the last 10 years that we know of what happened with wide receivers. And I don't think that's going to happen again, but it also happened in a year where we saw a lot of running backs really come through. And I like that because it's, for the most part, a pretty young group of running backs with not a lot of tread on them or not a lot of wear and tear on them outside of Le'Veon Bell. And that's a good thing. But we can have really good running backs and maybe a bounce back year for receivers, but it doesn't mean if you got burned by a receiver last year, someone may say, well, I took Beckham, it didn't work out, but the running backs are so good. No matter where I'm picking, no matter who is there, I'm taking 2 running backs to start my draft. Well, if you start your draft and you're picking, let's say, in the top 3, and you get Gurley or Elliott or Bell, and you come back around in the second round, and the best running back is, let's say, LaShawn McCoy, who's got issues off the field, who's on a bad team, and you look at some of the wide receivers, maybe Devontae Adams is still there, and you say, well, I'm taking 2 running backs, forget it. You're forcing yourself to make a pick that you don't need to make. I'll even go further up. Let's say you're picking at the end of the first round, and you take Leonard Fournette, and you come back around, and maybe the best running back there is Dalvin Cook. Now, that's a fine start if you want to go that way. But maybe in your head you're going, well, Dalvin Cook's coming off of a torn ACL. He only played a month last year. He's going into his second year. Now you've put doubt in your head, and you still say, well, I have to take a running back, so I'm taking him. What that may do, and I'm not saying it's a wrong way to start, but if you now are thinking about questions you have about Dalvin Cook, maybe now you're going to end up taking another running back sooner than you really need to. If you take 2 running backs to start, theoretically, you should be covered on that position for a while. But if you're automatically saying, well, now I got to be careful with Cook, so maybe I got to take another running back earlier, now you're throwing yourself off down the road. The first 2 picks you make, I would say, should leave very little doubt in your mind. And if that means adjusting off of your draft strategy, okay, I'd like to get 2 running backs, or I'd like to get 2 wide receivers, or I'd like to get 1 and 1. Maybe players get pushed down the board that you don't expect to be there. Be fluid in your draft strategy.
I agree, man. Tags and I have been tooting this horn for a long time. And, I would just say in the first 4 rounds, just draft value. It doesn't matter what positions. Just go into it being fluid, like you said, Matt, and get the best value for your team. It's going to play out. You can fix the rest in the later rounds.
Yep. No, Matt said it all perfectly. Honestly, be fluid in your situation. Like, every draft is different. If I'm drafting with analysts, I know it's going to be different than the public. If I'm drafting in my home league, it's going to be different than a different league. So yeah, absolutely. You have to remain fluid. I am team no strategy.
Let me just throw in here. I get questions all the time, and I'm sure you guys get them as well. When I'm on the radio, it's, hey, I'm picking 6. Who do you think I should get in the second round? And I hate to shut people down, but I don't know because, and that's the thing is, none of us are going to go in. I have picked 6 in drafts. I have picked first. I have picked first and taken Todd Gurley. I have picked first and taken Antonio Brown. And sometimes I come back around, and it looks great there. And other times I come back around, and I'm questioning what I like at wide receiver to start the third round.
Do you mean Antonio Brown first this year you've taken him, or like last year?
No, this year. I've done it this year.
Interesting. Okay, I haven't heard anyone say that, so I'm going to need to ask you, is this something that you would still recommend, or it was just where you were at one point?
No, I'm okay with it. It's once again, I think it comes back to my idea of what do I feel best about? What do I not worried about whatsoever? And he's that guy. Now, look, you're nitpicking if you're talking about Todd Gurley. What's the most you're going to say? Well, he's a running back, so maybe I'm more worried about him getting hurt. You want to take him number 1 overall. I've done it. I'm fine with it. I just go number 1 wide receiver, last 4 years in PPR. No concern about where he's at. I know what I'm getting from him. He fills up the stat sheet with catches and yards and touchdowns. It's not like he's a format-only guy. You know, Golden Tate's certainly a 90-catch guy, but doesn't go real far after the catch and may not score a bunch of touchdowns. Brown does everything you could want. He's on a high-volume passing offense. He is the man in that offense. I have no worry about him. He's just kind of the, I'm not going to screw around at all. I'll take him number 1 overall, and I'll work from there. I know it's not typical. I know you may want to get one of those all-around running backs like a Gurley or Elliott that's going to be busy as a runner and receiver. I get that. I'm not knocking that idea at all. It's just, to me, I don't find anyone safer than Antonio Brown.
Now, Tags, last year we saw Todd Gurley just carry people to the championship. Same with David Johnson the year before, Devontae Freeman the year before that. All 3 of those guys, if you had them, you probably won your championship. Now, it's going to be another running back this year, but maybe it's not these guys. I mean, we've seen Devontae Freeman take a big step back. David Johnson obviously was hurt. Todd Gurley, who knows what happens this year. So, Tags, I know that you think Todd Gurley's your number 1, but do you think that Antonio Brown is the safest?
Antonio Brown, honestly, I would consider him at the 3rd pick. I wouldn't take him over Todd Gurley or Le'Veon Bell. Those are like legitimately 2 workhorse running backs that I can't pass up. Like they're receivers on top of the fact that they are running backs, and they're actually pretty good running backs too. So combining the 2, you're almost getting 2 positions in one. Like those guys are in a separate tier for me. Like there's just no question. But if you want to tell me you're taking Antonio Brown over Saquon Barkley, Ezekiel Elliott, or David Johnson, I have no issue with that whatsoever. Because as Matt said, Antonio Brown is the wide receiver version of Todd Gurley and Le'Veon Bell. So the reason that I don't go Antonio Brown as high as that is just because it puts you behind the 8 ball at the running back position. Because by the time it comes back to you in the 2nd round, yes, you have Antonio Brown. That's all great. But you might be starting someone like Devonta Freeman as your RB1. And that's not something I really want to do in 2018, just because I think we've already seen that Atlanta timeshare developing more and more where Devonta Freeman's not getting those 20 touches a week. And Tevin Coleman's in the last year of his deal, so they could decide, let's use up Tevin Coleman, let's keep Devonta fresh because we plan on making a playoff run. I just think that these things are possibilities, so that's the only reason. Landing one of those workhorse running backs is pretty important to me this year.
All right, guys, I'm going to get to mine here in just a second, but first I want to talk about Fantasy Champs, the sponsor of today's show, and man, I'm looking at some of the stuff on their website, and they've got these amazing trophies. Like, seriously, just go to the website. It's going to take 5 seconds. You're going to be blown away by the quality of these trophies. They've got championship belts, amazing championship rings. Like, if you wear one of these, it does not look cheap. Now, they're really affordable. Everything on this site is affordable for your fantasy league, but seriously, go look at the quality of the work that they've put together, and you are definitely going to want one of these for your league. And we talked about things that can make your league better the other day. This is it. If you've got a big trophy to compete for and everyone wants this, if it's even beyond that and you just want a custom jersey for your team, maybe your league doesn't want to pay the extra money to get a championship belt, they've got these cool custom jerseys. They're $99. It's something you can wear every single season, and they just look beautiful. Like, go to the site, fantasychamps.com, and when you do, we've got a cool offer for you. You get 10% off your entire order if you use the promo code Fantasy Pros, all one word, at checkout. Again, that's 10% off at fantasychamps.com if you use the promo code Fantasy Pros, all one word. All right, guys, so the first one I wanted to mention is what you do with your bench. Okay, so once you get past the first 9 rounds, you've got your your I'd say 4 wide receivers, 3 running backs, and your tight end. Who cares about the quarterback? You probably don't have one at that point. Maybe Aaron Rodgers if you're me. Otherwise, I'm waiting for Alex Smith or Matt Ryan. Okay, so you've got your starters set. Now you're starting to build your bench. And rather than just going with these safe depth guys like we've talked about him before, Isaiah Crowell, or somebody like that, in terms of wide receivers, Deshaun Jackson, or Nelson Aguilar, Kenny Golladay. I know people love Kenny Golladay, but he doesn't have any upside this year because he's the 3rd guy on the chart. Sure, he's a decent depth play, but you can get those almost every week on the waiver wire. When you get to rounds 10 and past that, you need to go for the upside guys. You need to go for somebody like Dez Bryant, who we've seen him dominate before. You need to go for someone like Aaron Jones, who, if it falls the right way, we're looking at an RB1. You get 5 of those guys in your bench, 1 or 2 of them is going to hit, and then you've got an extra stud starter. You can either trade him, or when your stud starter goes down with an injury, you just fill him in. These depth guys, they're replacement level. Get them on the waiver wire if you need that during a bye week. What do you think, Tags?
I completely agree with this. In terms of, I think you do need some stability on your roster, but you could do that in rounds 1 through 10. Like adding guys like Demaryius Thomas, Christian McCaffrey. Those are stability guys that they may not win you your fantasy league, but they're not going to lose it for you. Drafting guys like Frank Gore in the 10th or 11th round, which is seemingly bound to happen this year because Frank Gore is getting love in camp and he looks like the same running back he did 10 years ago. Tell that to his 3.6 yards per carry over the last couple of years. Frank Gore, I'm sorry, like guys like that, they don't tempt me to draft them. Like, I'm not going to draft those guys because they're not going to win you a fantasy championship. It's just not going to happen, guys. So draft guys who have the potential to finish as top 20 options at their position. I don't see Frank Gore in that conversation with Kenyon Drake and Kalen Ballage there. So definitely agree with you.
I want to throw in another name too before we turn it over to Matt. Chris Thompson, they're saying right now he might not be 100% until November. This is somebody who, I don't know if you can start him week to week. He had like 3 good weeks. Besides that, he hasn't been startable outside of PPR leagues, and I don't think he's really someone you can trust. Again, he's just a depth piece that you use if your guy's on a bye or you've got an injury going on. Matt, is this how you use your bench as well for upside plays, or do you like these depth pieces?
I mean, so it depends. Like I said, I'm with you. You mentioned Crowell. I think he is kind of a nice, cheap guy to get, and that may depend on what you have in front of you, right? We said you can't plan too far ahead. It depends on what your roster looks like, but when you get into the double-digit rounds, they're all the same to me. I don't see a major difference. And for that reason, if a guy doesn't hit for 2 or 3 weeks, then move on. You're going to hit the waiver wire. It's going to happen. You're not avoiding it. So I do kind of like those upside plays there. I'm not a big fan of handcuffs because there's not always obvious answers to those, and it could be multiple guys. And yeah, like someone like Frank Gore, maybe in a best ball league where you go, I might get 2 weeks out of Frank Gore, and that'll be fine. That's different. But in your typical redraft leagues, I'm with you. I will shoot for some of those upside guys. And you just hope that if they don't get off to a hot start and you know what they're potentially capable of, that you have the room to hang on to them. But that's not always the case either. But then again, if you're talking double-digit rounds, you know what? You move on from those guys. It's not a high risk at all.
Now, you mentioned that you like Crowell, and frankly, we haven't had anyone come on the podcast and say that this year. Tags and I have been railing on him, but we want to give our listeners the opposite take so that they can, see both sides and see which way they want to go with it. So why don't you give your pitch on why you like Crowell?
Look, I'm taking him as an running back 3 and nothing more than that. That's about as much as I like him. And for a starting running back, that's not exactly high praise, but that's what he is. And now with Elijah McGuire banged up, the team never really seemed to get behind Bilal Powell. I'm not completely sure why, because they end up giving him the most touches, but they almost do it begrudgingly. And last year, he had about 42% of the carries, about 7% of the target share. And that's Matt Forte, obviously gone, banged up. And I just see a starting running back on a team that's going to start Josh McCown or Sam Darnold or maybe Teddy Bridgewater unless they trade him. They're still going to want to run the football. And that's enough for me. And that's enough for me to say he's a running back 3. And maybe, he's a running back 3 on a team that has Todd Gurley or Bell or Elliott or David Johnson. Not a running back 3 on a team that's led by Devontae Freeman. There's a difference there. But I don't mind having that just kind of solid, reliable depth. If he's my 3 in a 2 running back starting league, I'm not worried about playing him every week. Maybe he's a running back you take if you draft Mark Ingram and you just need somebody for a month, and that's it. That might be all it is. But I see a starting running back on a team that's going to need to run the football with a receiving core that has a bunch of really maybe a 2 and Robbie Anderson in terms of NFL terms, but 3s and 4s and no real answers there. So he's important to his team. Will he last the whole season? Probably not, but he's not going to cost you much either.
Tags, do you think that Bilal Powell is going to split carries with him or maybe even take over this job? Maybe even Thomas Rawls?
I project Bilal Powell to lead this backfield in touches, and the reason I do is because he's a better receiver than Isaiah Crowell. And the fact that Elijah McGuire did get hurt, that did change my outlook a little bit, where it's like, okay, if someone wants to draft Crowell, I get it. But I don't want to draft him because you know what he reminds me of? He reminds me of like a worse version of Frank Gore last year because he's playing on an offense that's not going to score very much. Like the Jets are not going to be a high-powered offense. It's just not going to happen. So I don't see many goal line opportunities. He's not that great of a receiver. Bilal Powell is a really good receiver. And Matt, you hit it on the head though. The reason that I'm hesitant to invest highly in Bilal Powell is because the Jets have been hesitant to invest in him. And granted, the offensive coordinator change and all this stuff, it's still the same head coach. And so when that's the case, you know, they've brought in guys into this backfield, like hoping that they could take it over and that Bilal Powell wouldn't have to be the guy. I don't know why, because he does well every time he gets an opportunity. I do see this as a timeshare. I was looking forward to Elijah McGuire as a late round sleeper because I think that he's a 3-down back that the coaching staff seems to like an awful lot. So I'm not giving up hope that he comes back and he makes an impact, but foot injuries are just disastrous. But yeah, Isaiah Crowell, I always think of it this way. When you get to these guys and you're looking at the board and you have Aaron Jones and Isaiah Crowell on the board, do I ever get excited about putting Isaiah Crowell in my lineup?
No, I understand that completely.
The answer is no, and that's basically the reason. And in my flex spot, I'm fine with a guy if he gives me 3 points and I miss on that, but I want the potential to get a 20-point game out of that guy. And Isaiah Crowell, he's probably going to get you 6, 7, 8 points a week, and that's kind of that.
Let me just throw in here because I know we're going to move on to the next one. Is I might have him on a team along with a pass-catching running back. Maybe it's a Tariq Cohen, where you do have that flex option, where you could say, all right, Tariq Cohen is not going to get 15 carries, but I know if he gets 6 or 7 targets potentially in a game, he could turn one of those into something big. So it's the flex option there, really, with a guy like that. And once again, this is how you construct your team. We're talking 7th, 8th, probably 9th round now when you get into Crowell. And that's going to be in the right context of what it means to your team. If he's your 3rd running back and may have to play from the get-go, you're probably in trouble. It's just depending on how he fits into your personal depth chart.
And real quick, something that people have brought up, Bobby, they brought up the stats on Crowell in Cleveland and comparing him to other players. Here's the problem, guys. Cleveland had probably what might be the best interior offensive line in football with Joel Bitonio, J.C. Treader, Kevin Zeitler, and now he's going to the Jets. We're legitimately, like, going through the draft process, I felt like they needed to replace 4 of 5 offensive line positions, and they haven't really done that. Kelvin Beachum is their left.
They haven't done anything.
Yeah, Travis Swanson at center, maybe I guess that's an upgrade, but there's 3 I have in the red. So I grade offensive linemen where it's like 3 in the red, and then 2 are kind of neutral now. So it's like, it's not a good offensive line, guys, so don't expect him to run the way he was in Cleveland.
By the way, do you guys remember in 2016, they finally gave Bilal Powell a chance? They didn't have any choice. And he finished number 2 among the running backs ahead of David Johnson, LaShawn McCoy, Devontae Freeman, Ezekiel Elliott, Jordan Howard, Mark Ingram, all these guys.
I remember the game. It was Saturday night against the...
Dolphins?
It was Saturday night against the Dolphins.
It was the Dolphins. I was right.
And by the way, Matt Forte was active for that game, and then they never played him because the Jets wanted to screw with us one more time, and Bilal Powell played well. I completely remember it. I'm a big fan of Bilal Powell.
He was great for 4 weeks, yeah.
But, well, this is going to lead us, I think, into our next mistake, I think, people make.
Why don't you go ahead and do it, Matt?
Okay. What I would say is the best way to phrase this is what we think about a player is not necessarily what a coach or a team thinks about a player. So I have made this mistake many years where I am saying, well, this rookie is got to play, and I'll go back to Ryan Matthews in his first couple of years with the Chargers, besides the injuries. Really good player, but Mike Tolbert was there. And as much as we didn't want Mike Tolbert to be vulturing touchdowns, he was stealing touchdowns from Ryan Matthews. And you're going, well, they're screwing up. Don't worry, it'll eventually be Matthews. And it wasn't. And David Wilson with the Giants couldn't get on the field because he was fumbling and because Tom Coughlin hated him because he was a rookie. So you keep going, well, he's going to be out there. And it didn't happen. So what I have to say is, and you hope it changes throughout the year, is your narrative on a player shouldn't be forced. And by that, I mean you don't take a player as high as you think he might be because you want him to be that guy. Recognize what the coaches are around him, what the team is around him. Would they rather stick with a veteran? Look what happened to John Ross last year in Cincinnati. He made people mad in Cincinnati. He never gets on the field. And if you thought he should have been out there, maybe he should have, it didn't happen. Derrick Henry last year, over and over. And I am not a big Derrick Henry fan, but Derrick Henry can be not good and still better than DeMarco Murray. And that's what I thought he was last year. So then you go, well, he's going to be the guy. And I'm going to project him to be the guy. And then he's not the guy. And you have to recognize that maybe we are right sometimes, but it doesn't mean that it's going to be right for the right reasons. We could be right and say, well, yeah, Derrick Henry should be out there. But then you overlook the fact that the coaching staff doesn't know what they're doing. So your narrative on a player may make sense to you, but it may not make sense to a clueless coaching staff.
So, Tags, where do we find the balance, man? Is it just a percentages game, or
offense matters, coaching matters? You know, people talk about Jerick McKinnon and how they're unwilling to draft him because he's been bad on first and second down, over his career. And the thing is, I can't disagree with them on that because if you look at the sample size, it's been a big enough one where he hasn't been good there. But the 49ers have kind of told you all that you need to know when they paid him to be like the third highest running back in all of football. They obviously have a plan for him. They're going to use him. So put your personal feelings aside. It's the same thing with like Amari Cooper. You know, a lot of people are down on Amari Cooper, and this kind of goes back to the whole what Matt talked about when people are just they hold a grudge against a player because he was bad last year. Don't hate Amari Cooper because he was not good last year. There was a lot of contributing factors. I came out with a player profile that's on the site now on him yesterday. I like Amari. I actually think that he's going to be a high-end wide receiver 2 this year with upside for more. So yeah, I love this. I mean, I like the conversations that we're having. It's because we all seem to agree on a lot of these points. So yeah, I'm with Matt on this one.
Tags, why don't you give us your next one, man?
All right, so mine is don't draft players with no equity. And now this all comes down to, well, Mike, how can I get a player with equity that's being drafted in round 1 and 2? You don't. That's the thing. Players in rounds 1 and 2, that's where I think Bobby, when he said you take the best value, that's what I do in the first and second rounds. Like I want a player that's, he's not going to lose me my fantasy league. That's for sure. But once you get past that, I want to look for players who don't have their upside built in. Guys like Adam Thielen, I believe, are being drafted at their ceiling. People are talking about they expect touchdown progression in his outlook in 2018. Well, that's fine, but do you expect him to see over 140 targets again? I do not. Tyreek Hill, he's someone. Again, by saying that you expect him, yeah, Mike, he might take a little bit back in the regression category, but he's still the most explosive player and blah, blah. You're drafting him near his ceiling. Instead, look down the board. Look at players like Devontae Parker, because what is the biggest correlation between wide receivers and fantasy finish? It is targets. The first thing you should look at is targets. Then you look at the talent. Then you look at the quarterback situation and kind of blend them all together. But targets always tell a big story. There were just 3 wide receivers in the NFL last year who finished top 24 with less than 100 targets. So if you have a wide receiver who you're not certain he's going to get 100 targets, I wouldn't be drafting him in the top 24. Now, Devontae Parker is being drafted as the 38th wide receiver off the board. This guy is legitimately locked in. In my opinion, if he plays 16 games, he is absolutely locked into 110, 120 targets. So by drafting him there, you are getting a massive ceiling, but you're paying for his absolute floor. Look for this. Don't draft a guy. I understand people liking guys, and I like Amari Cooper. But if someone tells me they're going to draft Amari Cooper number 10, am I going to jump them just to make sure I get him? Absolutely not. Because then I'm drafting him what I believe his ceiling is this year. Don't do that. Don't pay for a player's ceiling.
Matt, do you agree with this concept?
Yeah, I have something similar where I say I don't want to pay for the breakout because I think there's a couple names like that, and 2 of them, to me, I think you're paying for Jimmy Garoppolo's breakout right now. And I'm not saying it's not going to happen. I'm not saying he's going to have a bad year. I could like Jimmy Garoppolo, but also say I'm not going to pay QB9 prices for him right now. I don't feel the need to go do that, especially at the quarterback position. You have to pay a tight end 10 price right now for Trey Burton. I don't feel the need to pay for that breakout when I can get George Kittle about 29, 30 picks later or get another tight end a little bit later. I don't feel the need to pay for these breakouts. And another name you mentioned is Jerick McKinnon. I like Jerick McKinnon as a talent. I am well aware that Kyle Shanahan is very helpful to our profession as fantasy football analysts because he is fantasy friendly.
Would have loved him in the 3rd round, right?
Sure. But now, as a 2nd-round pick, I have to pay, as Mike's talking about, for that ceiling, for what a perceived breakout is going to be. So if it doesn't work out, anything that falls short of that is going to be a disappointment and is not going to pay off. So there are going to be guys that bounce back at other positions that you're going to get for cheaper. And I'd rather go in that direction. You don't have to value your way through the entire draft because that can probably cut back on the talent that you end up having and limit your ceiling. That I understand. But paying for the breakout of these players when there's other ways you can go and save and not have to worry that they absolutely have to come through with those values, I think you're going to be better off in the long run. You'll construct a better overall roster.
Totally agree, guys. Now, here's my last one. I wanted to come up with all my own content here, but Scott Pianowski of Yahoo shared something on Twitter yesterday that was just too perfect for today's show. I couldn't not use it. By the way, if you don't follow Scott on Twitter, it's Scott_Pianowski. He's one of the smartest guys in the industry. I mean, there's plenty of experts who think outside the box, but Scott is constantly getting me to change my mind about things, and here's what he said. My biggest draft tip, and this goes back 20 years, is to fade injury optimism. Let somebody else chase those top, hurt players' ranges. If you can't get a significant discount on a player already in physical jeopardy, take someone else. Injuries find you. Don't seek them out. And the reason I brought this up is because Doug Baldwin is hurt now. Everyone's still saying, well, I'm going to get a discount on him, so I'm still going to draft him. He's going to miss the preseason. Who knows how much longer? A sore knee and missing 3 weeks, that does not really go together. And honestly, Tags and I love Sony Michel, but if we find out that he's going to miss some time, I will be worried enough about him that I probably won't draft him. Tags, what do you think, man? Feel the same way?
Yeah, you have to pay attention to this stuff. Now, Doug Baldwin is someone I'm not worried as much as about, just because, like, Sony Michel is a rookie. You know, he needs to be on the field. He needs to learn the offense. Like, that stuff does concern me. But as for Doug Baldwin, he's got plenty of rapport with Russell Wilson. You know, he's the go-to guy in the offense. He's a veteran. He's been around. He knows what he's doing. And if he was a rookie, I don't think that they would be like, oh, he might be out the whole preseason. I think that they would be like, we need to get him back on the field, as soon as his knee feels better. It sounds like it's a light MCL sprain or something like that, where it's like, when players do that in season, they typically miss, 2-3 weeks. And why play Doug Baldwin through the preseason? Why rush him back when it's a player that he knows what he's doing? I'm not totally concerned, but this might push me to draft someone like Mike Evans over him just because there is a little bit. Use that as a tiebreaker with veterans. When it's rookies, it's going to affect it a little bit more.
Agree.
It's one of those where, like, Doug Baldwin I love, and he's got a ton of opportunity this year with no Graham and no Richardson and a defense that's nowhere near as good. And I really believe he could, if everything's okay, he could easily be a top 8, maybe even higher wide receiver in PPR formats this year. Just, once again, Mike brought it up. He's going to get a ton of targets this year. And I hope he's okay, but I got to keep an eye on that. Now, there's a difference between, as you guys say, a Doug Baldwin who's been there and is the man and probably doesn't need to be out there this month very much at all, versus a Sony Michel who, forget team, he is a rookie, and then you put in, of course, the Bellatrix of Bill Belichick in that backfield where it could be a variety of players. Yeah, he's a first-round pick, and maybe that gives you a little bit more optimism about him, but he's still a rookie playing for the Patriots. Everything's got to go right there for him to justify where he's going. So I'm with the idea. I've learned this. There's another thing you'll learn after doing this for 10, 15 years is these injuries, the optimism you may have, and you hear from coaches like a Pete Carroll, who's always optimistic despite what his record might show, throw that out the window. You got to see these guys come back. And don't forget, guys, and you guys know this, but if they say 4 weeks, if he's back in week 5, it doesn't mean he's 100%. And it's very easy for fantasy players to see their player come back, especially if he comes back like a week early, to forget about the injury and go, oh, he's fine. He's back on the field. There's not enough time during the season to recover from these injuries. These guys are right back at it. Even if they have a bye week, even if they get hurt on a Thursday and play the following Sunday, these are injuries that will linger. And I always keep that in the back of my mind. And how often, guys, do we find out after the season when players are pulling out of Pro Bowls, or we hear, oh, actually he played with a bad shoulder. Look at Alshon Jeffrey last year. Played all year hurt, but he played. And that injury popped up in the preseason, but we didn't really think much about it. And He got off to a kind of a slow start. He had some tough matchups, but he played through it and had a good season. Not a great season. And then it's, oh yeah, he played with this major injury all year. So anytime these injuries, I'm going to be thinking about that with Doug Baldwin. Even if he's out there in week 1, and I hope he is, I'm going to be aware that he had a sore knee that automatically put him down for 3 weeks or whatever it's going to be. That's something with these injuries, I would say, to kind of piggyback off that is don't forget about the injuries when guys come back from them.
You were talking about the Seahawks, and I'm almost like nervous to say anything about the Seahawks anymore because anytime I say something negative about them, I think their fans are probably going to cook me over a campfire one day. They hate when you say something negative about like Chris Carson.
Don't you dare say anything about Russell Wilson. Don't you say a bad thing.
Well, there's nothing bad to say about Russell Wilson. The rest of the team, there is so much bad to say. Oh, there we go. I'm going to get eaten now.
You're done now. I'll say it about Russell Wilson. This is the biggest season he has. We're going to find out how good he really is this year.
You're definitely right. Matt, before we let you go, I wanted to ask you, who's one player that you want to get on as many of your teams as possible this year?
I like Demaryius Thomas a lot. Value for me goes a long way, and I think he's got a shot to be a high-end wide receiver, too. I know we don't like to go too far back in terms of history, but even in the last 2 years, which haven't been great, he's been wide receiver 16 in PPR formats. He hasn't had a finish lower than that in the last 6 years, and yet, you're still able to get him at a wide receiver 19 price, which I'm a little bit confused by. And I don't understand that completely. I'm not saying Case Keenum's going to follow up last year with another great year, but he's going to be an upgrade over what they have. And they're trying to figure out what their backfield is. Whether it's Freeman or whether it's Devontae Booker, that's going to be somewhat in flux. But I think you're going to have Demaryius Thomas coming back. And by the way, I don't think Emmanuel Sanders is that far off this conversation either, because they do get similar target numbers for the most part, and they're clearly the most important receivers that they have, and nobody's close. We'll see about Jake Butt at tight end, but there's not a lot of talent here, and they're going to have to throw the football to these guys. So I've been getting Demaryius Thomas a lot. He's a pretty cheap guy to get, and I think, as Mike was talking about, you don't have to draft him at his ceiling. In fact, I think you're kind of drafting him closer to his floor now at wide receiver 19. So you don't have to pay up for that guy, and he can pay off. So he's a guy that I find myself getting in a lot of drafts. One more I would say is Dion Lewis. I am not a Derrick Henry fan. I saw the Derrick Henry value shoot up for that 1 week when DeMarco Murray was cut, and I understood it. But at the same time, Derrick Henry is not a guy to me that is going to dominate everything in Tennessee. They signed Dion Lewis. They paid him nicely, and that's the new group. That's the new staff that was involved in bringing Dion Lewis in. They inherited Derrick Henry, who, by the way, was fine last year, and I agree. He should have touched the ball more than DeMarco Murray, but I can also think that he's not a great player, and Dion Lewis can do everything. He did it for the Patriots. He cashed in on that. Derrick Henry is nothing in the passing game, and I think that's a big thing that people are overlooking when you're taking him in the 4th round or even higher in the RB19 conversation in PPR. Is this guy is not going to do anything in the passing game, nor do they need to force that. Like, I don't think it's going to be forced on Jordan Howard in Chicago because he's got hands of stone. There's no reason to. Derrick Henry had 17 targets last year. That's it. You're going to see Corey Davis hopefully take a step forward. You still have Walker, and you have a pass-catching back or a more capable one, Dion Lewis. So even if Lewis doesn't get as many carries as Henry, I don't think he's going to be that far off, and I think he's got a higher ceiling. So there's another guy, Derrick Henry. As Mike was talking about, you're drafting him at your ceiling. You're getting Dion Lewis like 2 rounds later, even 3 rounds later. So I'd much rather take Lewis over Derrick Henry.
I don't really know what the difference between Derrick Henry's value is last year at this time and this year, and he's going 5 rounds higher. Tags, did you see the picture of Derrick Henry next to Dion Lewis? He looked like an alien, man.
No, it looked like a little kid looking up to his dad saying, "One day I want to be like you."
Yeah.
Like, that
was the best thing to happen to Dion Lewis's fantasy value. That picture alone, because we go, man, he's that small, man. Derrick Henry's a monster.
Exactly.
All right.
Yeah, that made me happy.
I don't want anything to do with the giant guy, who's probably more Brandon Jacobs.
Yeah. I wanted to go back to Demaryius Thomas just really quick. I saw that Case Keenum, Kyle Borgognoni, editor-in-chief for the Fantasy Footballers, tweeted this out. Case Keenum was 3rd most pressures in the league last year, and he was super efficient. The most efficient quarterback in the NFL, mind you. And now he's going to the Denver Broncos. He's got some good wide receivers. You know, he's got the offensive line going for him. I think he might be a sneaky pickup in 2 QB leagues.
I have taken him as a best ball second quarterback if I get a higher end one. I've gotten Carson Wentz in some 8th and 9th rounds, which has been very lucky that he's fallen that far. And I go, you know what? Just in case, I'll take Case Keenum to have him. And then I don't feel like I need a third quarterback. But yeah, I'm with you there. I do like him. Another guy that's pretty much free based on any league you play in. Solid enough. And maybe just someone you go, I know what he did last year. He's coming to a new team. Even if you don't draft him, he's someone that you just kind of keep in the back of your head. In the right matchup, I don't think you're going to have any second thoughts about picking up Case Keenum.
Yep. All right, Matt, we really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks a lot, guys. Really appreciate it. And you got to plug my Japanese wrestling podcast, which was completely unexpected. So go listen to the Foreign Aces when I have time to do it, too. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks again, Matt. Take care. I'm now joined by Ross Tucker. You've surely heard him talking football any number of places, including Westwood One Radio on Sundays. Ross, thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. I love what you guys are doing at Fantasy Pros, and obviously I'm big into fantasy with the Fantasy Feast podcast, and loving it, man. It's our time of year.
Of course, yeah. So Mike wasn't able to be here for this segment of the show. I do want to ask you about some positional battles, though, what you see and hear about going on in camp right now. I want to start with the Dallas receiver core. Allen Hurns, got Michael Gallup. Tavon Austin, they're saying they're going to get a lot of touches as well. What are you seeing with this Dallas receiver core?
Well, I'll believe that Tavon Austin is a productive part of an offense when I see it.
Yes.
So I'll let other people draft him. I don't know if you're playing best ball, late round flyer. You know, I feel like I've spent half my life hearing glowing reports about Tavon Austin in the spring and in training camp, and then the season comes and it never actually happens. So I'm selling on Tavon Austin, to say the least. I just, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, whatever. You know how the expression goes.
Of course, yeah.
So I'm out on Tavon Austin. Now, I've always liked Allen Hurns, and I think Allen Hurns has been a little bit underrated. And now that he's kind of the man in Dallas, I think he'll be pretty good. And I've also heard good things about Gallup so far. But I think the guy to try to get, if you can, is Allen Hurns, because you read between the lines some of the comments from, you know, some of the Cowboys players, coaches. I think they're happy that Dez Bryant's gone, and I think Allen Hurns is a big reason for that.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting. He goes from Blake Bortles and not really doing a ton with Blake Bortles. Obviously, the 1 year Bortles was a top 4 fantasy quarterback, kind of a fluke with the garbage time. But Hurns was always blocked by Allen Robinson. Now that he gets a chance to be the number one, he's not a prototypical number one like a Mike Evans or anything like that. But he's going to get the targets. I definitely think that he's worth drafting in fantasy leagues. Tavon Austin, there's some excitement with him, as is the case every year. But the thing is, I think they're going to use him as a little bit of a running back. Now, obviously, they've got Zeke. But for best ball leagues, I'm a little bit intrigued. I've got some shares. But yeah, I'm not touching him in a standard fantasy draft.
No, I wouldn't do it. And look, I hope he is. I hope he is great, right? I mean, that would be awesome. I hope he is fantastic. He was such an exciting player in college. I'd love to see it again, but I'm not betting on that. I'm not putting my money and my time on that.
Who are you betting on in this Seahawks receiver core? Because now that Doug Baldwin's hurt, and maybe it's just a 3-week thing. We talked about that earlier on the show where he could be back for week 1. Maybe he won't be 100% for the first 2 weeks. But if Baldwin is out for a little bit of time, you've got Brandon Marshall, who's on the roster bubble, Tyler Lockett, who hasn't done much, Jerron Brown. Is there anybody else in this receiver core, or do you like one of these guys quite a bit?
So I would go, out of those names, I would go with Lockett. I am intrigued a little bit by Brandon Marshall sort of filling the Jimmy Graham role, if you will, in the red zone. You know, they don't really have that big body. So I wonder if, they have Brandon Marshall primarily for fade balls, third downs. I mean, Jimmy Graham's essentially a big receiver. And at this point of his career, Brandon Marshall's essentially a little bit of a smaller tight end. Those positions are not as different as people think that they are, even though we name them two different things. That's kind of how I looked at them acquiring Brandon Marshall, is that they really just want him for the same things they use Jimmy Graham for, because they're both so good boxing people out with their bodies. They're both so good in contested catch situations that I think they felt like there were some similarities there. But the receiver I like is Tyler Lockett. I think he's going to bounce back from his injury woes. He was so good right away as a rookie. That's always usually a really good sign. And they just needed him to get back from kind of being beat up the last couple of years. And I'm very concerned about Doug Baldwin. I don't care what they say. Just a couple weeks off. He'll be back for week 1. He might be fine, but there's really no such thing in my mind as just a sore knee. Like,
That was so weird.
well, if your knee is sore, that's because there's something wrong with it. Your knee is sore because there's something wrong with it. So, sometimes they hope it just calms down or they're able to manage it. Sometimes you have to end up getting scoped, whatever the issue is that's flaring up. But if it's bad enough that he's not going to play at all in the preseason, as we've heard, that's a concern. And they might say, okay, he's fine for week 1, but I wouldn't be surprised if week 4 or 7 or 12,
Exactly.
it crops up again. I would say buyer beware on Baldwin.
Yeah, that's what we were talking about earlier in the show, too. I'm just avoiding Baldwin. I have a lot of shares of him already in best ball leagues, and I'm kind of bummed out about what happened. You hope anyone recovers quickly, but Baldwin was a great value where he's being drafted. And keep in mind, when you guys are listening to this, Ross played in the NFL for a long time, so he knows what he's talking about with these injuries, and a sore knee is not something to take lightly. Now, you mentioned Brandon Marshall, and I just want to remind our listeners here. It was just 3 years ago, 2015, he was the number 3 fantasy receiver, 1,500 receiving yards, 14 touchdowns, 109 receptions. I mean, I understand he's getting older. He's 34 years old now. But this is someone who was dominant not so long ago. So, Ross, do you think he's someone worth drafting at the end of drafts just in case he bounces back a little bit?
Yes, especially now he could just as easily, by the way, get cut. But I think especially with the Doug Baldwin knee news, I think that makes the Seahawks even more likely to keep Brandon Marshall, provided he's healthy during training camp and the preseason and shows something. They're not really paying him very much, and they don't have a lot of other experienced receivers. So if there's a chance that Baldwin's health is iffy and that you're going to lose Baldwin at some point in the season, I think that's all the more reason why they would want to keep Brandon Marshall in the fold, just as sort of a veteran, experienced, pelt on the wall security blanket, if you will.
I was kind of laughing about the idea of anyone drafting Brandon Marshall just a couple weeks ago, but now I'm really coming along to the idea. It makes sense. That's what you've got to do. You have to adjust, admit you were wrong sometimes. And I don't know. I don't know what to do about this Detroit backfield because I haven't really had a take on it all year. I've just been ignoring the fact that it exists because I don't want to deal with it. Can you help me deal with it for once, Ross? I mean, we've got Amir Abdullah, Theo Riddick, LeGarrette Blount. We've got Kerryon Johnson. Is he the likely starter, or are they just going to throw all 4 of these guys on the roster and just give them all like 8 touches a game?
This is going to be New England 2.0. That's what Matt Patricia knows. That's what Matt Patricia does. And that's his experience, right? Is LeGarrette Blount is the power, and maybe he's a better matchup some weeks. And, certain runs they might think are good against certain teams. So it might be a LeGarrette Blount week. Other weeks they might want to throw the ball most of the game. Then it'll be a Theo Riddick week. They'll certainly get Kerryon Johnson in there. But remember, as a rookie, there's usually always issues in the passing game and the blocking and the protection part of it. And I think Amir Abdullah is still talented enough that he probably sticks. I mean, if you notice, the Patriots seemingly always have 4 pretty legit running backs. Like 4 guys that are capable of going out there, Dion Lewis and Burkhead and James White. And, they always have at least 3 and usually 4 because they know that it's like having different tools in your tool belt. And also they know that those guys, usually 1 or 2 of them get hurt. And they never want to kind of be left, holding the bag, if you will. So that's why I think that they keep all 4. I think they play the hot hand. I think it's a game plan and week-to-week thing. And I think you're probably going to be disappointed on a week-in, week-out basis if you put, all your bets on one guy.
Yeah, and a lot of people are drafting Kerryon Johnson as though he's the surefire starter. I'm just saying not so fast on that one. We'll see what happens here. I'm kind of crossing my fingers, actually, that Amir Abdullah gets cut and a team like the Jets pick them up, or Buffalo, depending on what happens with LaShawn McCoy, because I want to see Amir Abdullah let loose. You remember that first season as a rookie? He just looked dynamic in the preseason. His ADP soared. It went from like 90 to 45 overnight because he was so amazing.
Yeah, well, and that's the beauty of it, right? When guys emerge like that, it's so fun for us. I mean, how many guys, seemingly come out of nowhere and make big time plays? I remember a couple weeks ago, I was talking with Kenyon Drake from the Dolphins. He was telling me that he's literally met hundreds of people that have told him this offseason that he saved their fantasy team. He saved their fantasy season. So watching guys emerge is one of the real fun parts of the business for sure.
It's great. And preseason coming up here. It starts tonight. I guess right around the time we're going to be releasing this episode. There's going to be one or two guys that break out. Now, do you buy into these breakouts in the preseason? Like, are you okay with drafting someone earlier because you're seeing some success, or is it just kind of a fluke?
No, I am. Because even though teams aren't game planning, and even though, it might not all be the starters, that they're still being productive on an NFL field. They're still showing they can do it at that level. So I would absolutely move guys up or down. And by the way, sometimes you're going to be wrong, right? Like sometimes it is a fluke and sometimes it is legit. But I would just tell you, and I'm sure somebody has the data on this, but I would say more often than not, you're better off believing what you see in the preseason. Now, someone's going to put out an example. What about this guy, Ross? What about that guy? And I'd say, well, what about Victor Cruz? What about some of these guys, Terrell Davis, that,
Dak Prescott.
yeah, exactly. Russell Wilson. I'm like, more often than not, I don't know what the percentage is. Maybe it's 75%, but it's definitely more than 50-50 that the guys that flash in the preseason – there ends up being some merit to that. There ends up being something to that.
We've been talking about these backfield shares in Detroit, the receiver cores in Dallas and Seattle. I want to ask you, are there any surprise starting running backs? Like we've seen Alfred Morris in the past. I've talked about him numerous times where he just took over the backfield. Nobody drafted him as though that was the case. Is there someone like Peyton Barber could steal the job from Ron Jones or Chris Carson? I know that they've been pretty high on him, or maybe even Devontae Booker with Denver. Could one of these guys be a starting running back and we're just not really aware of it quite yet?
Yeah, I mean, the guy that stood out to me out of what you said is probably Chris Carson, just because I was really impressed with what he was able to do last year before he got hurt. And Pete Carroll is just talking him up so much right now. It's kind of bizarre, really, that they took, Rashad Penny where they did. But I would say Chris Carson. I wouldn't be surprised if Peyton Barber gets a bunch of the reps in Tampa. But out of the guys you named, I'm going Chris Carson because it looks like he's already there. I mean, it looks like it's his job to lose, and he's the guy that they want to put in there. And plus, we've seen him do it. We've seen him have a couple of flashy, really big-time games, and I think he's capable of doing that on week-in, week-out basis if, and there's always the caveat, he stays healthy. But you can say that about every guy. Now, look, there's injury histories and there's risks that you want to stay away from, but there's also guys that pay off in a major way because you get them lower than they otherwise should be drafted because of either playing time risk or injury risk.
It's so strange to me that they have all these holes. They're losing everyone in their defense. People are retiring, getting hurt. Richard Sherman's gone. They need an offensive line. They made some improvements there. And then they go out and get another running back in the first round, someone who was supposed to go in the second or third, and now he's not even going to start. I don't understand this. This is just nuts.
It's a little bizarre. I mean, they obviously really liked him and thought he was a difference-making player, and maybe they still had some concerns about Chris Carson coming back from the injury, but I tend to agree. I mean, I think we'll see. Time will tell, but given their other heavy losses, that was a surprising pick for me as well.
Yeah. Now, Ross, before I let you go, I want to ask you for one, maybe two players that you're targeting in fantasy this season. You just love their value. Do you have a guy or two?
Yeah, I've always been kind of big on Cam Brate, in Tampa, and I know a lot of people are looking at that and saying, well, Ross, there's O.J. Howard, there's two tight ends. I think that's reflected right now in where you can get them. I think that you can get them at a pretty nice spot because of that, and I just think whether it's Fitzpatrick or Jameis Winston, they have a lot of faith in him. As in the red zone especially. I mean, the guy is a touchdown maker. It seems like they designed the plays for him. So I like Cam Brate. I think that there's a possibility there with Cam. Other guys, I would say Probably Darius Geis. I've loved Darius Geis as a running back the first time I saw him. I don't know what he did off the field, but it must have been real, real bad for him to drop behind all those guys.
For real, right? Yeah.
Crazy.
I don't understand either, because everyone knew that he was the second best running back in this class, and he dropped so far, but he's got the talent, absolutely. He's going to get the opportunity. I love what you said about Cam Brate. They gave him the extension. Jameis Winston loves Cam Brate, and the Bucs use 2 tight ends all the time. So I'm fully on board for a late-round tight end. If you want to go Cameron Brate, makes a lot of sense to me. Ross, thank you for taking the time to come on. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me. You guys doing a great job. And if anybody's looking for more podcasts to add to their arsenal, I got a bunch of them for you over at rosstucker.com. I got a gambling one, Even Money, if you like to bet the sports. And of course, if you're into fantasy football, I got Evan Silva from Roto World every week, Fantasy Feast. We're doing his tiers of Evan right now, tiers for each position group, which is pretty cool.
That's tremendous. Ross, you do a great job, and I'm sure our listeners are really going to enjoy this treat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much.
It's our pleasure. Take care. That was Ross Tucker. You can find him on Twitter at Ross Tucker NFL. Earlier on the show, we had Matt Camp of the Bleacher Report. You can find him at the Matt Camp. Tags and I are at Bobby Fantasy Pro and at Mike Tagliere NFL. And thanks again to the sponsor of today's show, Fantasy Champs, where they've got championship belts, rings, all kinds of other stuff, great trophies. They look legit. You want one of these for your league, and you can get 10% off your order if you go to fantasychamps.com and use the promo code FantasyPros, all one word. Don't forget to sign up for the contest. Signed David Johnson jersey giveaway thanks to pristineauction.com. Go to fantasypros.com/contest to enter. For Mike Tagliere, I'm Bobby Sylvester. Thanks for listening, and enjoy your football.
I just wanted you to watch me dissolve.